Good morning. Good to see you all this morning. Thanks for making it out on this cold day, as has already been mentioned. It's very cold, but we're warm and comfortable, and we're glad to be able to be together, and thank God that we have this opportunity. We're starting a new study today in this Sunday morning class. We're going to be studying the book of Acts, but we're going to be studying it in a little different way. We're going to be studying by virtue of discussing various individuals, characters who are described in the book of Acts. Someone challenged me about using the word characters, Bible characters, suggesting maybe that implies these are make-believe or mythological kind of persons. And I really don't think that's an accurate interpretation of the word character. I think it's still fair to say we're talking about Bible characters, and I think that's a fair usage of the terminology, but we would not want to ever leave the impression that we think that these are fictional characters. They're not. They're real characters. They're real individuals, actual people who definitely lived, and their stories are told here in our Bibles. And specifically here in the book of Acts, we read about several individuals who have lessons that we can draw from. I've always appreciated and enjoyed doing character studies. I think that it's an easy kind of thing to grasp hold of, to kind of see what they dealt with, put yourself in their shoes kind of thing. So I always have thought there's great advantage to character studies. That's what we're going to be doing. So this first lesson, and by the way, if you don't have one already, there's some study guides on the table in the back that will help you prepare for this. This week, we're going to talk about the author of the book and the one to whom the book was written, Luke and Theophilus. So we start out talking about the author, Luke, and we got to do a little deduction in order to conclude that he definitely was the author, and we'll talk about that as we go along. The question was asked about Luke's profession. And we get that information from Colossians 4. We're going to be jumping around someday. We won't spend a lot of time right in the book of Acts, but Colossians 4:14, Paul identifies Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Luke, the beloved physician. And so Luke was a physician, a doctor. Now, someone might say, oh yeah, well, he was probably a witch doctor or something like that, some kind of a hocus pocus, black magic kind of an unlearned, superstitious fella that played on the emotions of ignorant people around him and all of that. That's just that. Anybody who would make that accusation just really doesn't know what they're talking about. Did you know that Hippocrates, who's considered to be the father of modern medicine, lived 400 BC? So 4 centuries before Luke was Hippocrates, and so the concepts of modern medicine existed long before Luke. It would be a terrible mistake to imagine him to be some kind of a voodoo witch doctor or something like that. That just simply wasn't the case. And I think that's really important for us because if you think about a doctor, about the specific training and education that would lie behind that profession, then that would lead us to believe that his account would be literal and factual, not superstitious. A lot of unbelievers think that the Bible is just full of a lot of superstitious connivings of people who didn't know better. And that's not the case. We firmly believe that that's not the case. We believe the Bible is literally, verbally inspired by God. But just thinking about Luke's education and background, you'd have to come to the conclusion that he's not writing about superstitious craziness. He's a knowledgeable person, an educated man who has the capacity to accurately relate historical events. And so I think there's some value into understanding his background. Yeah.
We don't know if Luke is even a Jew, maybe not.
We think he wasn't. Yeah.
He wasn't. He was inspired to write the book of Luke and also the book of Acts.
Yeah. We think he was. Yeah, we think he was the only non-Jewish author of the New Testament, in the New Testament. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Good point, Gordon. So when Luke wrote the book of Acts, it's clear that he was in Paul's company. It's interesting. We've talked about this before. Go to Acts 16 at verse 10. Acts 16 at verse 10. There's a change in the way Luke describes things. Look in Luke 16 now. Start at verse 6. Now when he's talking about Paul's traveling company, when they had gone through Phrygia and the region of Galatia and were forbidden of the Holy Ghost to preach the word in Asia, after they were come to Mysia, they essayed to go into Bithynia, but the Spirit suffered them not, and they, passing by Mysia, came down to Troas, and a vision appeared to Paul in the night, and there stood a man of Macedonia, prayed him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. And after he had seen the vision, immediately we endeavored to go into Macedonia. See that change of pronouns there, from they and them to we and us? So we think that Luke joined Paul's traveling company at that point in time. This would have been on the second missionary journey of the Apostle Paul. And we think that he stayed close at hand with Paul. Even through his imprisonments, we think that he was with Paul. In fact, when we read there in Colossians, Luke is with me, indicating that he was with him in his imprisonments. So, again, I think the thing that I would emphasize from this is we're reading after a knowledgeable man. We're not reading after some superstitious, uneducated fella. Luke was. You would pay attention, just like we today. If your doctor tells you something, you're way more inclined to give some credence to what he says than if it was just some stranger on the street. Somebody who has no credentials at all. You'd be more inclined to believe your doctor. And that's the case with Luke. Any thoughts or comments here?
He was the perfect person to write Luke about Christ, about describing his crucifixion and self-belief. He was perfect for that. I mean, he knew what Christ was going through his body.
Yeah, especially, I think you're right, especially in the matters of the crucifixion. When he makes reference to something that happened to his body, then Luke would be knowledgeable to describe those things. I think you're right. Wayne.
Yeah, the ancient Greeks came up with the concept of the atomic structure of things. So they knew a lot more than we think they knew.
Yeah.
And we kind of equate, we let the unbelievers or the skeptics kind of cloud our judgment, cloud our mind as to how much they really knew in the ancient world.
Yeah.
They had a great deal of knowledge, especially the Egyptians. The Egyptians were very knowledgeable in medicine and cosmetics and things like that.
Anatomy, they knew thoroughly.
Yeah.
I do think it's true that modern men, I'm speaking generally, not us particularly, but modern men in general tend to way overestimate our intellectual capacity and underestimate the intellectual level of ancients. I think you're right. All right. So notice how Paul described Luke in 2 Timothy 4. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 10. So now remember, we think these are the very, very last words that the Apostle Paul penned by inspiration. We believe that. So remember how we think that unfolded with Paul. He went to Rome, had a hearing before Caesar. He was waiting for that hearing before Caesar when the book of Acts ends. We think he was released after that trial before Caesar. We think he was released, enjoyed a short period of freedom, did some more traveling and teaching, was rearrested, and was ultimately executed for his faith in Christ. We think that this letter of 2 Timothy was written during that second imprisonment that led to his execution. And so these are hard times. This is right before Paul will probably be executed. He says in 2 Timothy 4, verse 10, Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Crescens to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. So here, Paul is facing imminent execution. He's at the end of life. And who's with him? Some had gone off on necessary work. I'm not saying that everybody had just deserted him. I don't think that's the case. But some had, and some had been sent off on necessary assignments. But only Luke is with me. I think that's really impressive. And so I think that speaks to the kind of character that Luke possessed. He was a devoted and dedicated and faithful person, both to the Lord and to his brethren, both to the Lord and his brethren, and especially to Paul. It would have been easy to say, I think Paul's probably going to get killed here for this. And if I'm hanging around here, that might bleed over on me. I might pay a price for showing loyalty to Paul. Apparently that did not concern him, and he stayed loyal to Paul to the end. So we understand a little bit about the man Luke. Let's go just a little bit further here. Philemon. Philemon. In the short book of Philemon, one chapter, notice verse 23 as Paul's giving his kind of closing salutations. So that we know the book of Philemon written to an individual man named Philemon. And he says in Philemon, I keep saying Luke, he says in Philemon 23, there saluteth thee Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, and Lucas, my fellow laborers. So he calls Luke a fellow laborer there among some others that he had named. Now, Philemon, we think, was written during Paul's first imprisonment, but even in this short letter to Philemon, he indicates he expected to be shortly released. So this would say, the earlier passage we examined said Luke was with him in his second imprisonment. This would indicate he stayed with him during his first imprisonment as well. Paul called him a fellow laborer. Would you be pleased to be described simply as a fellow laborer with the Apostle Paul? I think that'd be pretty high commendation. I don't think you'd really have to say much else. If you were doing a eulogy for Luke, and there's probably lots of things you could say to describe him, but you probably wouldn't have to say anything more than he was Paul's fellow laborer. That's high praise for sure. JD?
I just noticed something about the first imprisonment and second, almost, I guess, sermon ideas people come up with to contrast two people. But, you find here Demas and Luke both mentioned, both were with him in the first, and Demas left by the second.
Yeah. I think the thing that we should realize, these were hard times. These people were facing incredible challenges of their faith. And so, Luke's loyalty is we can talk about it. I'm not sure we can grasp what it would have taken to be loyal to Paul under such extreme circumstances. One more reference to his kind of character. Look at 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy 1:8. So Paul's writing to Timothy. We think Timothy was an exceptional servant of Christ too. Very exemplary young man. Worked hard in the kingdom. But Paul had to kind of build him up, kind of support him and encourage him. Look in 2 Timothy 1 verse 6. I put thee in remembrance that thou stir up the gift of God which is in thee by the putting on of my hands. For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Be not thou therefore ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but be thou partaker of the afflictions of the gospel according to the power of God. I think, and most people agree, that there's sort of a subtle rebuke of Timothy there, that he was maybe too timid, that he was scared, he was holding back. And Paul says, don't be ashamed of the testimony of the Lord, or of me, his prisoner. So if even Timothy needed to kind of be bumped up a little bit there, that he was maybe, holding back. If that is true of Timothy, then that even speaks more highly of Luke about his loyalty and his devotion and his working together with Paul. Okay, all right, now let's talk about authorship. So we get to know a little bit about Luke. What can we do to prove Luke's authorship of Acts and necessarily also of the Gospel of Luke? All right, so let's go back to Luke chapter 1. Luke chapter 1, verse 1. For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of those things which are most surely believed among us, even as they delivered them unto us, which from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. All right, notice in these verses, Luke clearly says that he's not personally an eyewitness of Christ, right? We don't think he was. Sometimes mistakenly when people, who are the 12 apostles? 12 apostles, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And a very common mistake is to include Luke among the apostles. He was not one of the apostles, and he was not a personal eyewitness of Jesus, but he was in close company with those who were. And it says that he is writing this to a man named Theophilus. We'll describe him in a minute. But notice the almost identical terminology in Acts 1. Now turn over to Acts 1. In Acts 1:1, you guys know this. Acts 1:1, the former treatise have I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach, until the day in which he was taken up, after that he had, through the Holy Ghost, given commandments unto the apostles whom he had chosen. So this is written to Theophilus too. And he speaks of the former treatise. And so it's clear that the former treatise was what we call the Gospel of Luke. And now he's writing a follow-up to that. They are both addressed to the same Theophilus. We'll talk about him in a minute. So we think that actually we've got to put some puzzle pieces together if we're going to conclude, because he never names himself. The author of Luke and the author of Acts never names himself, but we really think that this has to be Luke because of the fact that we already suggested Luke was with Paul, joined his traveling company during the second missionary journey in Acts 16 verse 10. And so we know that Luke was with Paul, wrote in the first person, talked about what we did, what happened to us from Acts 16 on. Those who are students of linguistic style say that the style of writing is very similar between Luke and Acts, sort of technical in nature, as you might imagine that a doctor would use sort of a technical approach in descriptions. There are also many extra biblical confirmation of Luke as the author. Actually, there's no one argues it. You can look to liberal commentators and conservative ones alike, and all concede that Luke is the author. Luke, the physician, is the author of Acts and therefore also the Gospel of Luke. Now, still looking at Luke 1, he describes the purpose for which he was writing the Gospel of Luke. He says there that it seemed, verse 3, Luke 1:3, it seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus. Some versions don't make that real clear, to write something in order, although I think you could get it from it, but I like the New American Standard Version there. It makes it even more clear, to write things in consecutive order. And so he intended to write a chronological report of all the things that had happened in the life of Jesus. And so he sets that forth. But always remember this, because I think it's kind of critical to our understanding, that Luke was not an eyewitness himself, but he was clearly in close contact with others who were, most notably the Apostle Paul, but others as well, and therefore, but we think he wrote by inspiration, and that being the case, he's not writing just what was handed down to him. He's not writing. So if he wasn't an eyewitness, the criticism of him would be that he's just passing along handed down information. You know, he's just telling us what was told to him by others, and we don't think that's the case. He was in association with those people, but his account is an inspired account. JD?
Do you think he's referencing his inspiration when he says, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first?
Yeah, I think so. I think JD makes a good point. There in verse 3, seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first. That'd be a pretty bold claim for someone who is just writing based upon their own recollections. You know, I don't think any of us would describe ourselves. If you were writing about anything, even things that you had personally experienced, but you know, I'm going to give you a perfect accounting of what happened last Mule Day. Well, that'd even be a bold claim, wouldn't it? You know, were you everywhere on Mule Day? Did you see everything that happened? Could you give a perfect accounting of everything that happened just a few months ago? Less than a year ago? No. We would not use that kind of description. So I think JD makes a good point that he's probably making a pretty strong claim there that his knowledge is perfect by virtue of inspiration. Wayne?
Also, what kind of a careful student would he be if he did not explore what the eyewitnesses' testimony was?
Yeah, right.
And as Luke in chapter 1, verse 3, it seemed good for us as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, that you might know verse 2 is what I was thinking of. Just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word have handed them down to us.
Yeah.
You know, he would have been very negligent as a careful student if he did not consult the eyewitness actual first-hand accounts of those. And every reporter, every news reporter in today's world would do that exact thing.
Yeah.
They would go to the first-hand testimony of those that actually witnessed whatever the event was, and would have gleaned from them. And of course, as you said, he didn't need to get that hand-me-down information because by inspiration he wrote what he wrote.
Yeah.
But he was still a careful student and
Exactly.
needed to have that studied information in front of him.
I think you're exactly right. Good point. Well said. All right. Okay. So we've got Luke. I've always thought, do you all think this way? I think praying that I can make it to heaven in eternity. And I believe we will recognize one. And some people disagree about that, that's not a critical point. But I believe we will recognize people in heaven. There's some people I want to talk to. There's some people that I would really like to have a sit down with. And one of them is Luke. I've always found Luke just to be an incredible individual. And I would love to think that at some point in eternity we'd have a chance to, hey, Luke, tell me about this or that. Give me a little more details on this part of the story. And I just look forward to that sort of thing. And Luke is one of the ones that I would look forward to having a conversation with. All right, so who's he writing to? In both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, he refers to Theophilus. Both are addressed to Theophilus. Now, the name is easily understood. Even if we don't know a whole lot of Greek, the word Theophilus is easy, right? Theo or Theos is God. Philos is love. And so Theophilus is one who loves God, a lover of God. And so the question has been, is that a real person, an individual, a specific individual? Or is that sort of a play on words? Luke's writing his gospel. Luke is writing the book of Acts to he sort of personifies the people that he wants to address to as being lovers of God. Bob is a lover of God. I'm writing this letter. He's a lover of God. I want him to know that, to get this information. Eric is a lover of God. I'm writing to lovers of God. Some think that it is more general in nature, but from what I've been able to deduce, there's a broader consensus. It's not complete for sure, but there's a broader consensus that it was probably a specific individual. Wayne?
The fact that he mentions him in Luke as the most excellent, as a title of dignity or nobility, seems to indicate that this was not just a general letter that was written to people who love God.
Yeah.
But it was written to a specific individual.
Yeah, I think so too. JD?
I'd also say that likely much more back then than now, people's names didn't mean something. So
Yeah.
it probably wouldn't be that unusual for someone to
Well,
have a name.
what I read is that it was a common name. It's a Greek name.
Right.
It's a Greek name and was common in that time. That there were people named Theophilus. So it was a common. But as Wayne suggested, it was also sort of a title of honor. Some academics would be sort of granted this title as Theophilus would be, what in our day and time we talk about a doctor of divinity, so you could get a doctorate of divinity at Vanderbilt, if you can imagine that. I don't know what you would learn from Vanderbilt about divinity, but some say that this would have been that sort of a title, could be potentially that sort of a title applied to an individual who had received that rank. Wayne?
Also, as Paul was arrested and he was going through his trials, he called, I think it was Felix, most excellent Felix.
Yeah.
This same kind of title that we're reading about with Theophilus.
Yeah. So, again, you couldn't fall out with anyone who disagreed, but it's probably likely that this is a specific person, Theophilus. Luke, as we said earlier, is the only non-Jewish author in the New Testament. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? And also, since he's addressing this apparently to a fellow Greek, we would argue that this book, both the Gospel and Book of Acts, were probably primarily intended for Gentile audiences. We know, for instance, we think Matthew's account was clearly written to Jewish audiences. Just the tone of it and the way it's addressed seems to be addressed specifically to Jewish audience. Luke and Acts probably look more like something addressed to Gentiles. That would make sense. I mean, that really fits, because when Luke joined in with Paul's traveling company on that second missionary journey, they were traveling among Gentiles. Their work was primarily among Gentiles. And so that Luke would be inspired to write these messages to Gentiles probably makes sense. Again, we think that Luke was writing this during the time that he was with Paul, beginning on that second missionary journey. Any thoughts or comments here? Questions? What's your overall opinion of Luke? You know, don't you develop opinions of different individuals in the Bible? You know, positive and negative impressions. I don't know anything that anybody could suggest that would indicate something negative about Luke. I don't believe there's a hint of anything you say, well, yeah, Luke could have done better right there, but he didn't. I don't know of anything like that.
And Greg, when you were reading in Philemon, did you say Lucas?
Yeah, Lucas.
I never, the King James?
Yeah, King James. Yours, what are you reading?
New King James.
It says Luke. It just says Luke, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You get kind of the idea that maybe Luke and Theophilus was best of friends, or they studied together, you know, and being physicians. I don't know what they'll say, but, you know, you get kind of the idea that Luke trusted Theophilus to write to him about what was going on with Paul in the gospel.
I think that's an interesting point. I never really thought about it. You know, potentially they had some commonality in their studies in the past. You know, maybe if he's an individual, and I think that he is, I think the stronger indication is he's writing to a specific individual. As you point out, there seems to be some bond there, some closeness between Luke and Theophilus, and so it could go back to their time in studies and academics. All right.
In verse 4 of chapter 1, I mean, if you obviously take the position, you know, that it's a person, it does talk about, you know, wherein thou hast been instructed. So it seemed to indicate that Luke had some level of more intimate knowledge of Theophilus.
He knew what Theophilus would have known.
Right.
Okay, good point. I hadn't thought about that. Good point. All right. Tom?
You have to think of something. Evidently, Theophilus was a Christian as well that wanted to know these things. I mean, if you look at the early church days, there were the apostles who were Jews that were held high, even to the point where up in Antioch, you know, those followers, you know, when James came up there, and even Peter was drawn away, you know, they separated themselves. So you sort of think that there was, you know, that early thing that, you know, that leaned to the Jews, and those Jews still had a sort of a semi-prejudice built into their acceptance of things. So here are these Gentiles being sort of considered second class, but not, you know, Paul addressed that in a lot of ways. But they were looking for those that became teachers of themselves and had influences among them. And your Theophilus, you know, writing to them could take and be that instrument to that.
Take it further.
You don't see that Luke is writing it just to Theophilus to, you know, having just all these my books, and I'm just gonna hold on to it. He'd written to share, and if he was a Greek, he was going to share this to the Greeks. And if you go back and you start looking at Luke, and when Luke addresses the miracles, he goes into a little bit more detail than some of the other writers on the things. He takes in a different perspective with that. You know, he, like cleaning the lepers, he goes in and mentions about, you know, some of them were, you know, one was a Samaritan and different things, and how he did things there, and how, you know, how Jesus, he would tie the Jewish things to it that related to, you know, the world around it. So it was more than just, oh, Jesus, you know, did this miracle. He did this, and this was the result of it, and people saw it, and it spread out.
Yeah.
So,
I do think one of the big things we want to really stress here is that these were knowledgeable people. These were intelligent people.
yeah.
These weren't just ignorant, superstitious, uneducated fools. These were highly educated individuals, and they had the proof, and they were convinced by the proof. And I think their faith is sort of a bit of evidence for our faith, for sure. Thanks, everybody. Next week, Peter. Got a lot of information about Peter, especially in the first chapters of Acts. And we'll look at Peter next week. And again, there's study guides on the table and back to help you prepare. Okay, thanks, everybody.